So the first one was just a review article to kind of give you an idea of what a review looks like. Then obviously writing your own review article for the next.
Okay, so the first one is just over the one review article that we find, and then the next one is like a review over 10 different sources of stuff.
Yep.
Okay, over the topic that we picked.
Yes, and you can actually use that same article for your review paper.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, the key is your review paper should be a synthesis of everything you've learned, like those review articles you looked at. So it shouldn't be in article 1, they did this. In article 2, they did this. In article, if you do that, it's really easy for me, you get enough. Instead, I want to see that you synthesized it. So you're going to be like, in articles 1 through 4, they found this reoccurring theme, but article 5 maybe disagreed. And why did article number 5 disagree? Was it a different population? Was it being used in a different way? What's really going on there? Look into the minutia. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, let's go ahead and let's talk about fat. Now, here's the thing, guys. If you want to instantly fail my class, all you have to do is this. Say that the fat is what makes you fat. An excess of any macronutrient is a reason why you gain weight. A lack of enough macronutrients is going to be the reason you lose weight. So when we talk about fat, one of the major issues that you guys are taught, which is obviously fat bad somehow, which then again, I guess now fat is good because you can do the ketogenic diet, and or all of these fats are bad for you, all of these fats are good for you. It's more subtle, okay? Now, fat is a great source of energy. That's going to be the one that we can have stored in our muscles, we can use for energy. We can also free it up from our fat cells to use it anywhere in our body for energy. And we have a little bit that's floating around our bloodstream, hopefully not too much because that's a bad thing. And it's going to outlast our carbohydrates. So last week we talked about carbs. In a perfect world, you've got about 2 to 3 hours of legitimate, moderate to high intensity exercise before you're effectively going to be out of carbohydrates. You're going to be gassing out. Now, when it comes to fat, now for the example in the bottom right, this is for a normal 176-pound dude that has 15% body fat. Now, that's guy that's not, he's kind of lean. Like that's not really fat. That's definitely something that's in some type of shape. Now, notice the amount of calories, and that's gonna be bracketed between the amount of fat stored inside of the muscles and inside of their actual fat cells. They literally have enough energy to walk from Richmond, Kentucky, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and still have some energy left over. Takes about 100, for a guy that size, about 125, 130 calories a mile. And he's got 111,000 calories of fat stored in him. So that's literally enough that he can walk about 800 miles on just the stored body fat. Now that's a lean guy. Now let's take a person to Walmart. If it wasn't for the Rockies, they could probably walk all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the sweet news is, by the time they got there, they would be so freaking lean, and or maybe have died due to lack of other vitamin and mineral intake. But we store excess of any nutrient as fat. And fat is the major fuel source you're using when you're not exercising. So if you don't really work out, fat is a macronutrient that you're going to need arguably more of than carbohydrate. And you do have 2 essential fatty acids. That's going to be alpha-linoleic acid and linolenic acid, which is your essential ALA, omega-3, and your omega-6 fatty acids. Now, the problem with using fats as fuel, which is we can only free up fat so quickly from our adipocytes. We can only transport it out of the fat cells and in the blood at a certain speed, and we can only get it into our muscles at a certain rate, and then even into our mitochondria through that CAT1 and CAT2 shuttle, which uses carnitine, in order to get it into our mitochondria for energy. So fats are never going to metabolize as fast as carbohydrates. Does not matter what person is telling you how they put MCT oil in their coffee and now they can run through walls. It just doesn't work that fast. And the other thing to keep in mind is if you look at the right, when we talk about hormones, remember, epinephrine is going to help you free up more fats for fuel. Whereas insulin is going to inhibit your breaking down of fat and using that as a fuel source. So arguably, for some folks, that's why a low carb diet actually does help with helping them lose more body fat, because we're not going to have as much insulin that we're producing. So we're not going to be stopping the breaking down of fat. Now, like I listed before, transporting fats into your cells takes more time. Typically, it needs to be effectively wrapped up in some type of transportation molecules. It could be chylomicrons, HDLs, LDLs, VLDLs, etc. From there, the medium chain triglycerides can skip this point and go right in. We do store fat inside of our cells, and that's, in fact, if you look at the picture on right underneath, you're going to see where we have the mitochondria, and right next to it, we actually have literally a lipid droplet, which is going to be where we're going to pull those fatty acids into the mitochondria adjacent, along with those we're going to be pulling from the bloodstream. Now, when we talk about the CAT1 and CAT2 transfer system, you can actually see the carnitine and the acetyl L-carnitine or acetyl-carnitine transport right here. That's literally how you get fat into your mitochondria. And this is why some energy drinks and otherwise have carnitine as a means to enhance fat metabolism, but it doesn't really seem to happen that fast. Now, once we get in there, we have beta oxidation, which is going to shave off 2 acetyl-CoAs off of that fatty acid at a time, meaning 2 carbons. And that's a 4-step process that's also going to go ahead and render an NADH and an FADH2. Now, probably not, because carnitine isn't a hormone. Protein question? Which protein is what helps fatty acids transport into the cell? If it was a protein, then yes, that would have been carnitine. That's okay. It's okay. So here, guys, is that actual process where the fatty acid is going to come in through acetyl-CoA synthetase. It is then going to go into phenylacetyl-CoA. This, in turn, is going to be shipped into the mitochondrial space and bonded to carnitine, which creates acetyl-carnitine. So the fatty acid is effectively bound to the carnitine. Goes through translocase into the mitochondrial matrix. From there, it's going to go ahead and combine with CoA-SH. And then we have, congratulations, another acetyl-CoA, and that's what's going to go through for beta oxidation. One of the major rate limiting steps. Now, when it comes to using fats as fuel during exercise, it's low intensity. Once we start cranking up the intensity, guys, that's where we're going to start really increasing the total amount of energy that we're producing through breaking down carbohydrates. So notice, guys, we have our fat oxidation rate and then our exercise intensity. Notice you burn a bit more fat when we get to about 60 to 65% of our VO2 max. But once we get over about 75, you see this precipitous drop. Now, that's because most of your energy production is coming from breaking down carbohydrate. So if you're talking about the fastest rate of breaking down fat, that is in that lower intensity exercise aerobic zone. It's going to be at super low intensities where we're just going to be using pretty much purely fat as an energy source. Now, if you go ahead and look to the right, guys, you're going to see that low intensity where it's plasma fatty acids, a little bit of plasma glucose, and then the actual fatty acids stored inside the muscle. And as we increase our intensity, notice we're going to use more of that intramuscular storage, but also now we're going to start leaning on muscle glycogen, and that's what you're really, once you're going even higher, what you're getting. Now, this is just the total amount of fatty acids available between control and a liquid heparin, which is going to free up more fatty acids, and then effectively the fatty acid rate, which is, notice even with all that extra greater amount of fat inside of the bloodstream, you're still not getting that much faster of fatty acid breakdown. So the big key, guys, at the end of the day, which is fats are great, they're the key fuel source for pretty much barely moderate, but definitely low level intensity exercise. And if you're somebody like a power lifter, a shot putter, anyone else that just relies heavily on the ATP PCR system, and then you can recover with beta oxidation, you don't need carbohydrates, you'll be fine. Now, if you're someone that goes into hardcore anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic glycolysis, carbohydrates are your friend. You don't want to lean just only on fatty acids. So if you're someone like a wrestler, a boxer, MMA, basketball, that's where carbs are your friend and you should not be afraid of them. You can get away with doing kind of the ketogenic diet approach, but you have to be on point with your carbohydrate consumption, like we talked about last week with pre, peri, and post-workout nutrition. So that way you're going to be able to keep yourself in ketosis while helping bolster your performance by giving yourself more carbohydrates to use. So as we get to be more and more well-trained, we are going to be able to use more fat at lower intensities, but we're still going to have that crossover effect when we get up to higher intensities. If you start really going super high fat diets and lower carbohydrates, same type situation where you're going to be utilizing that a bit more because it tends to be a preferred fuel source. Just like if you do a very high carb diet, you're going to start to use carbohydrates more preferentially. So if you look in the bottom left, guys, we're just simply going to be looking at the wonders of the ways that we're getting in those fatty acids. Remember, the medium change fatty acid, meaning we're talking about lengths of carbons that are going to be typically, I believe it's going to be about 12 or less, is going to pass into the blood or into the cells a lot more rapidly because we don't have to use transporters like we do with palmitic acid, which is an 18 carbon fatty acid, which is much longer. Any questions through here? No? I'm just cruising. Everybody's picking up what I'm putting down. Ready to go ahead and, stand on the rooftops and tell everybody how this stuff works? All right, so now we get to talk about, oh, good, somebody said no. I like that. Who's the one voice of reason? They've already disappeared. That sounds like the voice of reason in 2020. Speaks once and then disappears forever into the night. I like it. So let's talk about the Randall Cycle. The Randall Cycle is effectively how, as exercise intensity increases, we're naturally going to start to use less and less fatty acids and rely more and more on carbohydrates as a fuel source. So notice, guys, as we have greater amount of calcium available in the cell, meaning we're utilizing a lot more contractions because it's released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, we've got higher amounts of ADP and AMP and phosphate, we in turn are going to break down more glycogen, okay, and convert more pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Meanwhile, when we have higher amounts of acetyl-CoA, because we're probably shifting over to using carbohydrates more, we're going to inhibit that CPT1, the CAT1, CAT2 proteins, so we're not going to actually be transporting as much fatty acids into the cell. So even though we have the advantage of epinephrine and calcium, which is freeing up more of those fatty acids for metabolism, in all reality, as we go up higher and higher in exercise intensity inside of the individual muscle fiber, we're going to see a greater preference and requirement of carbohydrates as the fuel source, as opposed to fatty acids. So one thing that can be useful is increasing the total amount of fatty acids you actually take in, because it's going to be slightly sparing for the amount of glycogen you can have left over at the end of doing training at moderate intensities, aka taking more calories, because it's going to help you fuel your body and perform better at a higher level. So I have talked too much at you guys, and it's time for you guys to go ahead and have a little fun. You guys are going to be divided into 4 separate groups. Each group is going to get a classification of fatty acids. Can you guys see what's down here on my slides? Let me just actually do this. Hopefully it pastes okay. So in your group, group 1 is going to have saturated fatty acids. Group 2 is going to have trans fatty acids. Group 3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Group 4, monounsaturated fatty acids. In your group, you need to find 2 specific healthy fatty acids in that group. I didn't say classes of fatty acids. I said specific examples of healthy fatty acids. And then you need to find 1 unhealthy fatty acid inside of that class. So for example, to help out the trans fatty acid group, look up conjugated linoleic acid, CLA. That is a healthy trans fat. Probably something none of you guys had ever really heard of or realized before I said that, and that's fine. That's why I want you guys to go in there and really think about what's really going on in the individual fatty acids. Because a lot of you guys were probably taught to think of it as a bucket. Saturated fat bad, trans fat bad, poly good, mono good. It's more complex than that, and we're going to get into it a bit more. But I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes in your groups to look up those fatty acids. And then when you find them, okay, what do they do to help your body? What do they do to hurt your body for the good and the bad, okay? And then where you'd find it as far as sources. So does anyone have any questions before I randomly assign you into those groups? So have fun, get after it, and I will have you guys meet back in 10 minutes. Write everything out so you can just copy and paste it in the chat, and then we'll be able to go through it, and I can give you guys some feedback and we can talk about it more so. Have fun. See you guys soon. Sorry. I stopped recording that for a little bit, guys. So great job once again going through the saturated fats, the polys, the monos, the trans, remember trans, CLA, vicinic acid, all the rest are dumpster fire. Caprylic, lauric, otherwise, whenever we're talking about saturated, palmitic, or palmitate, not so much. DHA, EPA, GLA, which is a really cool one for gamma linolenic acid. But linolenic acid itself and too much from the omega-6 can be issued with pro-inflammatory. And it's really hard to find a fatty acid in the monos that aren't good for you, because those tend to actually be nothing but good choices. So if you're going to overeat on any of the fats, you really want to overeat on monos. But getting back to your great question about the dairy, and then how are we going to make sure that people are getting in everything they need? You can get it through your vegetables. You can get it through your protein through meat. You can even get your protein through vegetables. It's just going to be a lot of quinoa you got to plow through in order to do that. And then you got nuts and otherwise you can do for the fat. But that actually is going to lend itself to a fun little conversation we're going to have at the end here. But when you're talking about any athlete, you got to be careful of deficiencies. And deficiencies don't show up tomorrow. If you guys stop taking in fat today, how long, and go and throw up the guess in the chat, how long do you think it would take before you start to have some negative issues from not getting enough fatty acids? Oleic acid for our monos, uric acid for the monos. How long do you guys think you could live without taking in a fatty acid? No fat, just straight carbs and protein. Protein shakes and pixie sticks until you die. How long do you think you'd make it? In all seriousness, not that you would ever run this, because this is this is incredibly unethical. Most of you guys could probably survive for 6 months. Yeah, because you have a lot of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids built into you. Key is you're going to start harvesting them, pulling them from other tissues, and using them to help support. Because you can synthesize all of the other fatty acids except for when you actually look at the slide right here, you can't synthesize ALA. And then ALA converts into EPA, which converts into DHA. Since you can't synthesize those, you're on your own. Now, here's the thing. Let's go to that vegetarian or the athlete that just decided they want to go vegetarian or vegan. They're a long distance runner. They're female, so they're on a monthly phlebotomy schedule, and they said they're going to be completely vegetarian, but they're not doing any deliberate work to make sure that they get enough iron. How long do you think it's going to be before their performance starts to go to hell? Usually gonna be about 2 months, maybe 3. But that's the problem, is they'll convert over to that vegetarian diet. Be like, oh my God, I feel so much better. I feel pure now. Every morning I can hear the birds and whatever nonsense people do when they really get into a diet because they like the idea of it. And they're like, the game changers changed my life. I'm so much better now. And then 2 to 3 months later, all of a sudden things are falling off the wheels because we have reserves in all of these things. So you can afford to make a dumb decision right now, and you're not going to probably feel the effects of it for a couple weeks, if not a couple months. And at that point, you no longer think it's your diet, you think it's because of X, Y, or Z. And then you're blaming the wrong thing because once again, we've been slowly spending if you think about your bank account, all of a sudden you're going to start outspending your income. If you got a decent amount in your savings, it might take you a couple months or years before you're finally broke. And they're like, how did I get broke? I'm like, well, you started making a dumb decision 1.5 years ago, and then you slowly march yourself into the issue. So that's the thing to be really careful of with, if we go and eliminate a food group, we just gotta make sure to replace it. So the calcium thing, your bones aren't gonna break the next day. If they did, Jesus, we had other problems. They're probably gonna have issues 2, 3 months down the road because your body has been having to use the calcium for muscle contraction. And by harvesting it, your bones have become more brittle and then stress fracture. Now, you guys have probably seen supplementation with fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, the ways to help a little bit with recovery. The research out there as far as decreasing all-cause mortality, it actually does help. It's not a huge, like massive effect, but if you want kind of a little insurance policy to help with long-term health, get in some more fish oil. Doesn't mean you need to supplement with it. You could just eat more good fatty fish like salmon and otherwise. And how many of you guys have heard of either ketone supplements or the ketogenic diet? I got you. Okay, long-term, Blaine, a lack of fatty acid intake, they're actually going to start to show it mostly in their skin. Their skin's going to become really cracked. In fact, that was the discovery of essential fatty acids because their skin was falling apart and one of the nurses literally rubbed baby oil in them. And they were so deficient in fat because they were living just off of IV amino acids and dextrose that literally their skin started to heal and their health improved. And they're like, oh, well, I guess maybe we need fat in the diet also. Yes, exactly, Hannah. Because the choices you're making right now, unless you're talking about just getting stupid hungover or just, you decide to go hard in the Chinese buffet and then run where you just know you're self-sabotaging, your diet is making effects on your future self. So how many people, yes, they think in the short run they made a great decision. Well, one of the students is currently A, wearing his mask, doing a good job, but B, further back in the classroom tonight. And I'm going to pick on him because it's perfectly useful. But Jai, I want you to chime in. How damn superstitious are your teammates? If one random thing happens differently when they go up to bat, the next time all of a sudden they're doing like spit, stretch, like they have like 87 things. None of those actually probably made the difference on them hitting the ball, but they think like, oh, that's why I hit the ball. And then any of you guys ever had that teammate that's like, as long as I don't wash my underwear or something like that, I perform better. Like wearing the same compression shorts. Oh man. Oh, it's not weird if it works. Jai, superstitions are not good for anyone. So, does that answer your guys' questions, both Hannah and Blaine?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, what's going to happen whenever it comes to just a couple different modifications in the diet? First, which is fasting. If you're not eating anything, your body is going to be utilizing more fat as fuel because you don't have enough glycogen. That's really not a great way to increase performance, but it is a way to kickstart ketogenesis and put you into a ketonic state. aka the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is really useful if you have drug-resistant seizures. Have you guys, okay, I keep throwing the term out there. Anyone, and just either unmute yourself or go ahead and just put it up in the chat. Does anyone not know what the ketogenic diet is or has not heard of it? It was like kind of a really big fad, probably like a year or two ago. It seemed like everybody and their mother was trying it.
It's still a big fad. What do you mean?
Oh yeah, well, it's originally the Atkins diet and then it's been modified with time. But okay, so you guys are pretty familiar. The initial advent of the ketogenic diet is really cool. There was essentially, I believe it was a wealthy family. I'm sorry, I cannot remember their name. Their child unfortunately had seizures, and they literally went around with money to doctors, like, try to figure out a way to fix my kid. And they effectively played with the diet, and they realized when they took out pretty much all the carbohydrate, 80% of the diet was fat, which is really hard to do. And then the last 20% was just enough protein to keep yourself from falling apart, but not so much that you'd have enough protein to go through gluconeogenesis, and it fixed the seizures. The kid was no longer having seizures. And to this day, the research shows that if after 3 different pharmaceutical interventions, aka heavily researched, the strongest pharmaceutical interventions you can find on the planet don't fix your issue with seizures, those individuals who then try the ketogenic diet, it works for half of them. How crazy is that? The best drugs that research can produce get beaten by simply just cut out the damn carbs. Half the time after more than one has failed. That's insane. Now, the key is with the ketogenic diet, however, it's very hard to adhere to. And outside of that, the possible medical effects are actually going to come down to what's known as the Warburg effect. Okay, this one's a little trippy. I want you guys to ask questions, but you need to understand this because this is something that's kind of cutting edge. And by the time you guys are older, it might be more important. Cancer cells typically are really bad at utilizing both beta oxidation and aerobic glycolysis. The reason for it is when a cell is malfunctioning, the mitochondria typically tell it to go through apoptosis, meaning take yourself out because you're not working right and you're going to take the rest of this thing down. Cancer cells are obviously not about that. They're instead keep replicating themselves, obviously potentially metastasize and kill the host. So means your cancer cells like to use anaerobic glycolysis as their major energy source. So one potential modality for the ketogenic diet is in individuals that are going through and dealing with effectively very fast growing cancers because you kind of starve them out. The other is, if you guys haven't seen like the whole intermittent fasting or fasting mimicking diets, where the idea is if you go super low calorie, it's actually going to in turn put most of your cells into more of a senescent state. So they're humming along at a much slower metabolic rate. But since they're at the slower metabolic rate, your cancer cells can't dial back. So as soon as you put the chemotherapy drugs in you, the cancer cells gobble it up because they can't do anything else. And that tends to shred them while keeping your healthy cells healthier. Because if any of you guys have had a friend or a family member that's gone through chemotherapy, that shit is rough. Like everyone that I've known, I had a guy I played soccer with growing up. He looks a decade older than I do now. I remember I hadn't seen him in years, and I know I heard that he had leukemia when I went off to college. I was like, man, I hope he's okay. And he looked like he was in his 30s when the rest of us were still in our early 20s. Because it's hard, because it destroys and jacks up all your cells. So ketogenic diet, potentially fasting, mimicking diets might potentially have a really good use, but the science is still really young. So we can't make really sweeping statements as to this is what's going to save your life and this is what isn't. Nice. Exactly, Blaine. So when it comes to specifically seizures, ketones effectively are a slower burning fuel than carbohydrates. So when you're in a ketogenic state, you've got really low blood sugar, which means when the brain tries to have a seizure, which is just a massive electrical discharge throughout the brain, it doesn't have the energy to do it. It literally can't go fast enough. It's the equivalent of the wildfire can't spread if it doesn't have the fuel to burn. So hence, it can be useful in those very specific contexts. Now, if we give you a high-fat diet, you're going to see there's some studies that'll show that it'll slightly increase the amount of work you're going to be able to do just because you've got more carbohydrates or more energy inside of you. But in reality, if you're going to really look at aerobic style athletes, higher carbohydrate is going to trump high fat diets any day of the week when it comes to overall increases in performance. Now, understanding cholesterol is another subtype of fat. It is the precursor, not just for being very useful in the cellular membranes throughout your body, but to your hormones that you have inside of your body. So you want to have enough cholesterol, so you have enough testosterone production, you have enough estrogen, you have enough cortisol, aldosterone, etc. Now, outside of that, when we're talking about the omega-3 to omega-6 fatty intake, that in turn is going to literally influence the amount of cholesterol that you're taking in. So what you're going to find is some individuals are literally taking in so much omega-6 that it's causing their body to produce more cholesterol, which in turn is making their cells a little bit stickier, kind of like that higher amounts of trans fat, which in turn is going to potentially lead to more issues with effectively a little bit of that atherosclerosis inside of the body. So it's not just the cholesterol in your diet, which rarely is actually influencing your blood cholesterol levels. Instead, it's going to be that ratio to omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid intake. And then we have is a number of different oils and effectively what class of fatty acid is making up most of those oils that you might be intaking, along with the basics of these are ketone bodies that we're going to use. It's actually, ladies, does acetone sound familiar?
Acetone.
Yep.
Yeah.
What is it?
Nail polish.
Thank you, Abby. Nail polish remover. That's a ketone body. That's why when you talk about ketosis, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but ketoacidosis, which is uncontrolled production of ketones, specifically in individuals with diabetes, it is literally potentially lethal. So you can get into ketosis, but you got to be healthy. You got to know what you're doing. If you've got type 1 diabetes, that's not something to screw around with. So last but not least, let's have a little fun with application of our knowledge. So yet again, I'm giving you guys 4 different options, okay? Now here's the basic thing. Each of these, example 1 obviously is relatively easy. We're going to time the fat throughout the day, and that's the big key for that group, which is think about if you go high fat with a meal, what is it going to impede? What is it going to enhance? And one of the things that I'll throw out immediately, guys, is fat's great because it slows digestion and gives you greater sensation of fullness. So since it digests slowly, you don't want it around your workouts. And if you have it more towards the end of the day, it's going to help you feel fuller longer. So it's a tactical decision. When you're on super low calorie intake and you go super low fat, that's where your essential fatty acids become that much more important. So think about which ones you prioritize. And if you're a ketogenic athlete, I just want you guys to try to put that together with essentially how would you do 200 grams of fat? And I swear to God, if it's eat a stick of butter, I appreciate the insanity of that statement. However, I'd like something that sounds a little bit more like you wouldn't hate yourself for doing it. And then finally, and this is literally because this is one of my friends, you're going to do 70 grams of fat for a vegan who is allergic to nuts and seeds. So give the basic food examples, the fatty acid choices, and why you're going to make that. And you can give them as many meals throughout the course of the day as you'd like to. So does that make sense as far as what the expectations are for this final little breakout room groups? And do you guys want to use the same groups, or do you want to switch it up and make some new friends? And actually, I think because, unfortunately, since Blaine just got dropped. Well, we'll see how this goes. We're going to go ahead and try to use the same ones. Blaine, I think I'm going to have to manually move you into the group 2 again. But otherwise, have fun, guys. 10 minutes, break it down, and make sure you're giving us those examples and those fatty acid choices. Have fun, guys.